The story begins with the spectacular arrival of a handsome knight in the square of the capital of the great empire of Istris. The young and handsome knight, mounted on his magnificent horse, drove a carriage that glittered with luxury. Crowds of people gathered around, cheering and shouting enthusiastically that it must be Her Highness's carriage. No wonder, for the knight was so beautiful that he attracted the admiring glances of the girls who saw him. The carriage was approaching the gates of the imperial palace, well guarded by knights on horseback. The carriage arrived, the knight descended from his horse, approached the carriage doors, and opening them, extended his hand to the princess, uttering the words, "Your Highness, they have arrived." A graceful figure stepped out of the carriage, the princess of the Empire of Istris, known as Tiffany Felicity Stewart. She was a young lady with long blonde locks of hair, wearing a magnificent gown adorned with jewels and a pattern of scarlet roses. Always when someone from the imperial family came to town, people, even children, would rush over to see this magnificent moment. One of the girls who saw the princess couldn't hold back an enthusiastic exclamation, "Princess Tiffany is as beautiful as an angel." A boy standing nearby said, "I bet 10 gold pieces that she will be the heir to the throne." The magnificent Princess Tiffany was certainly the object of everyone's admiration and deserved a place on the throne of the empire. She herself was surprised that, and people so confidently say so. Tiffany and her sister were always told from childhood that they would be the noblest women in the empire. When people are told the same thing all the time, they start to believe it. That's what happened. She thought so too, until she saw her sister being defiled to death with her own eyes. It just so happens that their father, the emperor, helped the killer cover it up, and Tiffany, as the little sister, turned a blind eye. Unfortunately, the eldest princess suffered from an incurable disease so voiced by the emperor, their not father. But from that day on, Tiffany realized the truth. Even if by some miracle she survived, she would eventually become nothing more than a plaything for the nobility. So every night, sitting on the floor around the candles, Tiffany tried to think of some spell to be heard by the witch, begging her, saying she'd give anything to be able to control her own destiny. And one day she was lucky enough to get an answer from a witch who granted powerful healing magic to her. However, she also placed a curse that said Tiffany must marry the man she spent her first night with. The spell would only be lifted if that man sincerely spoke his vows of love at the wedding ceremony. Otherwise, she'll be dead in a year. Soon after, her sudden awakening was noticed by her father. She had a chance to compete for the throne with her half-brother as she wanted, and today is the day when the heir is chosen. Only when she takes the throne can she control her own destiny. When the princess entered the castle, she was met by her half-brother. He said, "Your Highness, she will surely be the first queen of their empire. The dead queen and princess would be proud of you." The boy took her hand to kiss it, but the princess took it and said she was grateful for his words. Then the girl replied that the candidate should prepare in advance and asked her to forgive her, and she would leave. Her half-brother said to see her in the banquet hall. At the evening banquet, the atmosphere was filled with magic. Many guests dressed in luxurious outfits waltzed merrily around the dance floor under sparkling chandeliers. Music filled the air with notes, giving the evening a unique melody. People from different corners of the empire were getting closer, exchanging warm greetings and smiles. Loud laughter and joyful conversations were heard all around, and wine of exquisite varieties was drunk as a sign of celebration. The moment the cheerful dancing was replaced by excitement, the emperor called for silence, and the hall was filled with expectation. The emperor announced that the purpose of today's visit was known to all, and the tension became even more palpable. At this moment, Tiffany felt her heart begin to beat frantically, and drops of sweat dripped from her forehead onto her face. She realized that she had been preparing for 10 whole years to become the heir to the throne. This moment was vital to her. The emperor announced that Joshua Cromwell Stewart was crowned Crown Prince of the Empire. The majestic banquet hall was filled with the cheers of the invited guests, who joyfully congratulated the prince, and applause rumbled throughout the hall. Only Tiffany realized that her dream of inheriting the throne had not come true, and the bitterness of disappointment enveloped her. She was so excited that she felt sick. The girl started to faint because everything around her seemed to dissolve. Her personal knight anxiously asked, "Your Highness, what's wrong?" But Tiffany could only repeat that it couldn't be true. The morning came, and the sun's rays gently stroked Tiffany's bed, as if caressing her face. Her hair was carelessly tousled on the pillow, and she was covered with a light, soft blanket. Tiffany struggled to open her eyes, sat up on the bed and suddenly grabbed her head. She had a sharp pain that she didn't understand how it could have come from. There was a knock on the door in the room. Tiffany turned around in the direction of the sound. The girl wondered who was there, who had come to see her. In answer to her question, a knight knocked on the door. He asked worriedly, "Your Highness, how is she feeling?" Tiffany began to remember what had happened yesterday. She realized that she had lost the right to inherit the throne. But what happened after that, why she couldn't remember, was a mystery she had to solve. Suddenly, snippets and memories of last night began to appear in Tiffany's mind. She remembered a certain man saying that she was the first to start. She remembered only the rough hands of this man, whose face remained unknown to her. He had touched her soft skin, and his whispering sounded like the devil seducing her. These memories began to overwhelm her. Tiffany realized that when the spell began to take effect, she would no longer have time to fight for the throne. She would be dead in a year, and that became an unbearable threat. She realized that she had to find this man and make him fall in love with her. However, her plan also included killing him once the curse was broken. Once again there was a knock on the door, and a male voice said, "Your Highness." "Why is she silent?" "He saw Count Albert leave here in a hurry. Did he say something to you?" asked the knight. Tiffany was startled and surprised by Count Albert's appearance. What he was doing here she did not understand. She thought grimly, that lusty bastard Albert, what he left in her room. He'd somehow relied on his looks. He'd even tried to trick her once. Could it be possible that the first time she was taken by him? Tiffany didn't understand how to act. She tried to get out of bed and call for her knight Frey, but immediately felt very sick, as she suddenly realized that the curse was taking effect. The girl fell to her knees, coughing blood out of her mouth. "What's going on?" she thought. Her hands and mouth were covered with blood, and a puddle of her blood had formed on the floor. Outside the door stood the knight Frey, who heard the strange sounds. He said, "Your Highness, I apologize, but I'll be right in." Tiffany then yelled for him not to come in and assured him that everything was fine. The girl told him to wait for her in the study, and then Frey obediently replied that he would wait for her in the study and left. Sitting on the floor, Tiffany desperately didn't know what to do. But suddenly a witch appeared in the room and said, "I think the curse has worked, dear. She's so careless." The girl was astonished to see the witch and said, "A witch! Is she here?" The witch had a beautiful bottle in her hand with some kind of potion inside. She said, "This bottle contains her life energy, and it will diminish over time." The witch then turned the bottle upside down and began pouring this life energy directly onto the girl, announcing that this was the first payment. Tiffany jumped up to the flow of energy, trying to catch it, and screamed, "Wait! Why so much at once? Why not in a year?" In response, the witch merely replied that she thought the clever girl should get rid of the curse as soon as possible. Tiffany seemed to try to grab the witch to ask her questions, but she was like a spirit, elusive. When the witch disappeared, Tiffany was left sitting on the floor, assessing her hands. She realized she'd drunk almost half the bottle. In fact, it's not true that she never sought out the witch, but in the end she only lucked out seems to have gotten a questionable gift. Honestly, she hadn't expected the curse to actually work. Now she had to figure out what had happened that night. Tiffany changed her clothes and went to the bathroom to clean herself up. A little while later, Tiffany's office. Tiffany and Knight Frey meet in the study. As agreed, the girl asks, "Does he remember what happened yesterday after they announced the name of the heir?" The knight replies that he does. Tiffany took a cup of tea to calm down a little. Taking a sip, she told him to tell what he remembered. The knight wondered why she was suddenly asking about it. The knight said, "Your Highness fainted," and then quickly corrected himself and wished to return to his chambers. He was ordered not to follow her. After hearing that, Tiffany realized that it sounded like someone was controlling her, but she didn't know how to find out yet. The knight went on to say that afterward the Duchess spilled a drink, and he went to change with her. When he returned, the maid said you were asleep. Tiffany asked what he did afterward. Frey said something happened with security, and he helped until the banquet was over. Then the girl realized that this man had deliberately separated her from Frey. But that's assuming, of course, that Frey isn't lying. Then Tiffany told the knight to go back to her place and she'd call him if she needed him. After all, no one can know about the curse, and not even him. Frey tried to say something, but Tiffany interrupted and said that she'd said it would be okay and he could go now. Tiffany was alone in the room going to the window. The girl started to think that everything was fine. There was still time. Just need to hurry up and find this man. The girl had nothing to do but take pen in hand and begin to draw up her plan of action that was at the ball. It took her a lot of energy to recognize and remember where she had been. So at 6 o'clock in the evening, the banquet began. At 6:30 p.m., she drank wine, the key word, and fainted. She said she didn't feel well and had to go back to her room to change. At 6 hours and 45 minutes, the imperial physician came to see her, but she refused him. At 7 p.m., Frey came to see her, but she escorted him and refused to be guarded. At 7 o'clock and 6 minutes, the observer, that is, the stranger, saw her quietly leave the banquet with Albert without anyone else seeing her. 8 o'clock, 6 minutes later, the observer saw her standing in the garden in the rain, and he took her to her room to change her clothes. 8 o'clock 30 minutes, the watcher and others helped her to change her clothes. 8 o'clock 40 minutes, he came out and told the Meadows to stand at the door. 9 p.m. The banquet was over. The only but was that there was no one who would say she had been alone in the room for an hour. If she had known sooner, she would have finished Albert off. The girl crumpled the sheets of paper on which she had written this plan of action with anger. While Tiffany was thinking and freaking out that she couldn't remember anything, a knock sounded on the door, and a maid came into the room and said, "Madam Duchess confirms that Duke Charles is dead?" Tiffany, with a worried look on her face, questioned what. Did the doctor confirm? The maid said that yes, Madame had already started with the funeral procession. Tiffany stood back and thought for a moment, but then said that she hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly and asked the maid to tell Freya that he would go to the funeral with her. The maid said okay, and left. The girl thought that Hertzak was a relative of His Majesty's family. She must be very sad. The funeral had been in preparation for over 6 months, and he had never died. And then suddenly, bam, that was it. However, it was a good opportunity for Tiffany to meet Albert again. Some time passed. Many family and friends had gathered at the Duke's mansion, and Tiffany was among them. The room had a somber atmosphere, and all the guests were dressed in dark clothing, reflecting the mourning and respect for the departed Duke. Tiffany was also dressed in a black dress with a black hat. She knew all too well that this was not the time for brightly colored outfits. Everything was stilted and modest, for this gathering was more an act of remembrance and respect for the departed than a celebration. There were many people in the room, and everyone was talking to each other. While together, Tiffany walked between people, then awkwardly attended to some of the conversations. One of them she heard a girl say it was more God that he supported the princess to the last. The girl said she thought so too, that the princess's support was everything to him. So he passed away. Well, Tiffany wasn't interested in that kind of talk. Her main goal was to find Albert in this crowd of people. When Tiffany went up a little higher to look around the church, she heard a conversation, or rather the words, "She's a woman," and it became clear to her where Albert was. She found him because he was the only one who could talk like that. Albert's interlocutor told him what's the point of fighting for the throne if she's going to end up married. It's just that it's obvious what's left is cheap. The interviewer said to Albert, and Albert said back, yeah. Albert turned his head casually and saw Tiffany. He thought damn she didn't want to talk to him about that night. Albert's character is 22 years old, his birthday is December 22nd, he is a count. The tarot card of fate he has a lover is a mythical character, and the tarot cards are Aphrodite. Albert didn't really want to talk to Tiffany about that night, so he thought, no, we should leave now, and really started to run. He took off at a brisk pace and headed for the exit. His friends tried to ask where he was going, but he didn't even answer them. When Tiffany saw him trying to run away, she thought, what nerve. As in the great hall there was suddenly a scream. A male voice said, "Whose knight is he?" and pointed his finger at the knight Frey. This man was Baker, one of Joshua's supporters. He kept pointing his finger at Knight Frey and telling him to kill him himself. Of course, he was standing there with wine all over his head and dripping down his cheek and a huge stain on his shirt. Tiffany rushed to them to find out what had happened. She said it was her knight who made the mistake, so only she has the right to punish him. "Magnanimous, your highness!" exclaimed Earl with burning eyes. "Your loyal knight fell into temptation and committed the audacious crime of dousing him with wine." Tiffany, alarmed by what had happened, turned to Frey with a worried question. "What happened here?" The boy couldn't hide his anger, and admitted that Earl had said some foul words about her, and he couldn't help himself. Earl, undeterred, continued his fervent monologue. He claims that he has previously expressed the opinion that foreigners have no place in the ranks of our magnificent imperial knights. Tiffany felt hurt and insulted, but instead of engaging in profanity, she decided it was better to keep quiet so as not to give cause for more insults. A wine glass appeared in her hands, and she resolutely poured its contents over Frey's head. Then, without waiting for an answer, she turned to the Count and asked, "Now, Count, are you even?" To which the Count replied with equanimity, "Why can it be considered due payment?" And then the Count came up with an idea. He said, "Let's say he'll let you save face tonight, and he just needs to get on his knees and apologize." The people present, of course, all began to discuss, some saying that the Count was really cruel for humiliating the princess. But some were so clever as to say that, well, why she indulges her knight when she herself has a precarious position. After all, she herself is well aware of the situation. Caroline Stuart, the Emperor's cousin, came into the Great Hall. The girl said it was the Duke's funeral today, and that's the end of it. Earl replied that if Madame said so, he would settle the score with him after the funeral. Frey thought that a minute more and he'd finish him off. The Duke's reception room, Caroline and Tiffany have a private conversation. Caroline says she just lost a little bit of power, so they started bullying her. Tiffany handed a handkerchief for her knight Frey to wipe himself with and said nothing back to Caroline. Then Caroline said, why don't she give Frey to her to help protect him? But Frey said he'd promised His Majesty to protect the princess temporarily and was not his property. The girl said, Okay, she was just kidding. She picked up some trunk in her hands and said that she'd soiled his clothes yesterday, so her tailor made him a couple of new ones. Caroline pulled out 2 vests from there and said, rather choose what he likes. She really wanted him to try them both on, and it would look very intimate on the Frey. At that moment, Tiffany realized it looked like Frey had really been harassed yesterday, and she even guessed who. Tiffany briefly said Auntie she's the one who killed the Duke. Right at that moment, Caroline felt a little sick at hearing those words. Tiffany asked she was purposely sticking it to Frey so her alibi would be confirmed. But afterward, Caroline quickly gathered herself and said, Tiffany, don't make jokes like that. Tiffany was very calm and confident in her words. She knew it from the moment she started drugging the Duke. To which Caroline replied that she had eyes and ears in this house too. Caroline wondered what to do. She right from the first time. Too bad we don't know what she was thinking, because she was interrupted by Tiffany, who said, Don't worry, she won't judge her or ask her to do anything. Caroline asked why, and Tiffany responded very angrily because he really deserved to die. Even though she was born a noblewoman, she couldn't stand up to her husband, and her body was always bruised, so she told Caroline a little bit about Tiffany's life. The girl asked to change the subject and said Auntie could she call Albert on her behalf. Caroline grabbed her head because the whole conversation had been a bit explicit and she wasn't ready for that. She had a headache and thought of Albert. He seemed to say something had happened and he had left. Then Tiffany has nothing more to do in this house. She stood up abruptly and said, Sorry, she just remembered something. So she'll go. Auntie yelled at her that men can't win. But Tiffany didn't even turn around, said that Auntie would let her inherit everything and be free, and left the room. She heard a man's voice shouting to her from behind, Your Highness. Behind Tiffany, Earl was running behind her screaming Your Highness, and he really needed to say something. When he got to her, Knight Frey held him back instead of letting him go. Then Earl started shouting that Your Highness was doing what she was doing, and if His Majesty found him guilty of smuggling, she would suffer too. Tiffany turned her head slightly, and said she didn't know what he was talking about. Then Earl yelled again that she should remember that she was in charge of the port. Tiffany said, So what if he dies instead? That's more important to her. The same night, Albert's room. The guy is having fun with one of the girls in his room. and the girl asks Albert that the princess is obviously the most beautiful woman in the empire. Why doesn't the master like her? And Albert tells her because she's crazy enough to take revenge. Then the girl says yes, but everyone says she's very kind and gentle. Albert replies that at least now she has her own things to do, so she won't come here. And Albert told her to stop babbling and to do something more interesting. The girl started flirting and saying, "Oh, don't hit on her." While the couple were having a nice conversation and having fun, the first thing they heard was the maid who said, "Your Highness, if you're coming now?" Albert turned around with his girlfriend and said they were very embarrassed to be seen by so many people. Tiffany said it turns out dating an earl is very difficult. The girl ordered everyone out of the room, and that included Albert's sweetheart. Albert said, "Your Highness, he was honored by your arrival at his estate. Why didn't she just send someone to fetch him while the boy was talking he was wiping lipstick off his cheeks?" Tiffany said she had made a small deduction and gained the knowledge that Hertz Charles had died of lysergamide, which was quite common in the earl's domain. Albert dared to raise his voice at the princess and say that he hoped she didn't visit him because she suspected him of murder. Tiffany came over to Albert and started to help him button up his shirt, which was unbuttoned, saying that the Duke was having health problems, so he had taken a drug to cheer himself up. He said he could button his own shirt, but Tiffany went on to say that His Majesty had sent her to him to help clean up the black market of the hallucinogen. So she earnestly asks him to be silent, buttoning up the last button. She said that the Count, why did he think she might doubt him? Well, let's remember last night dear Albert, who put his hand on his shoulder and looked at him with very sincere eyes, said the princess. Albert took a step back and said that he didn't mean to push her away at all. They were getting desperate, thinking that if it wasn't him, then who was it? But she decided to take a rash step and asked him again. He's aware of the consequences. And Albert replied that he was extremely careful and attentive. There is 0 chance of pregnancy. Like she wasn't furious, all right. That's who was with her last night, but then why did he run away? She asked. Albert replied that the princess had had too much to drink, and he thought that in the morning she would not remember what had happened. After all, he doesn't want to talk about what happened then. He accepts any punishment. In the past, he might have been impressed with the idea that the princess was an innocent and harmless girl. But now, his opinion was drastically changed. He thought that if he married her, he would become a member of the royal family. He remembered how they stood together by the water, and the princess said that the wind by the water was very frosty. The Count replied that it would keep your Highness warm. In the end, he hugged her quite boldly, and the princess turned around and said how brave he was that he was even willing to do such a thing. Tiffany pushed him forcefully over the railing and the guy couldn't hold on, causing him to fall into the water. Then the girl shouted, "He thinks it's his end," grabbed a rock. She threw the rock into the water. The memories ended. Albert came back to reality. He stood and thought that even begging for mercy, she would never let him go in his life. He wished they would take off their masks. Tiffany said, "Count, doesn't he desire her?" Looked at him and smiled. Albert got embarrassed. Empty-headed, he said he had no idea what she was talking about. What a joke she is. Then Tiffany said in a very sad voice that since she didn't get the title of His Majesty's Princess, Crane was considering her marriage. And Tiffany said try to get her favor by walking up to the Earl and hugging him, poking him in the chest. Albert wondered if the princess meant to say she was going to marry him. The guy had a look of horror and confusion in his eyes. The next morning he rode off on horseback somewhere. Tiffany had just seen him leave the manor. She asked where he was going early in the morning, and the girl said the master had not told her of his plans, only warned her of his late return. Tiffany said she had lost her necklace and asked for help finding it. Tiffany already had a plan in mind and needed to get into Albert's room any way she could. But she must have left the necklace in the garden. Why did she say that? So that all the maids would rush to find the necklace and she could get into the room in peace. And so it was. According to her plan, everyone ran into the garden to find the necklace and Her Highness. The girl came out of her room and thought as far as she could remember, Albert's bedroom should be around here somewhere. As she looked around her room, she was surprised to see a pearl in her hand, and said it was the pearl from the dress she wore at the night ball. Then, according to the Count, she was drunk and seduced him. So whoever was controlling her chose Albert or someone else. When suddenly the door opened and Albert came in saying, "Princess, what is she doing here in his room? Her knight wasn't here at Albert Manor yesterday, but today he's here for some reason." Then Tiffany and Albert went out of the room into the corridor where the knight Frey was already standing, bowed and said, "Your Highness." He wanted to go on, but Tiffany interrupted him and told him to wait a minute. She'd finished talking to Albert and they'd go. Tiffany turned to Albert and said Count she would find a way to find out everything about him, and smiled flirtatiously at him. The girl began to list if he had a mistress, what he loved and what he hated, and slowly briefly ran her finger over his muscular chest. She said she wanted to know everything about him. Albert said a little indignantly that Your Highness, if she was really interested, she could easily ask him. Well, she didn't say what she thought it was, or how she thought it was. He wasn't at the manor this morning. She'd been wanting to talk to him since this morning. Suddenly the butler came up to them and said, "Sir, they had just received news of—" Well, he didn't have time to finish either, for he was interrupted by Albert. He grabbed the butler by the scruff of the neck and they left the corridor. But before he did, Albert said he had some business to attend to. Tiffany and Frey went outside for a walk and some fresh air, while Albert went about his business. Tiffany asked why he came here and Frey said his night shift was over and he had time to rest. The girl clutched her head. It was a little sore. She said it was okay this time. Replied that he no longer intended to help the princess with the investigation. The guy explained that his duty to protect love affairs is beyond him. Tiffany didn't like it so much, she thought. What if she told him someone wanted her dead? When he approached Frey, the guy guessed why she was here. He said she suspected someone, so it was the Count, and the girl answered correctly. Then Frey said why in her head would she think such a thing? But Tiffany couldn't tell him the truth. Then it suddenly came to Frey's mind that he'd seen that there was a well-guarded house on the Count's estate that seemed to be hiding something or someone. Tiffany wondered, and what is it? But Frey said it's not. The guy didn't have time to finish his sentence because Tiffany noticed Albert walking behind them and told Frey to finish talking later. Turning to Albert, Tiffany asked what was wrong, and the guy said they had found a brothel where the hallucinogens were being distributed from. Tiffany said she'd go with them, but Albert said it was too dangerous and he was against it. Tiffany said she's not even more dangerous than her and started flirting with Albert again to try to win his heart. Tiffany turned abruptly and rushed forward, calling for everyone to depart. Albert replied that Your Highness could travel, but that Frey had no such opportunity. Tiffany wondered why Frey couldn't go, since he was her knight. Albert shouted excitedly that these drug dealers would obviously be wary if they saw a foreigner as her knight, and it might attract their attention. Then Tiffany waved her hand and said Frey stay, but the knight came up and said no. Your Highness, he can't leave her and let her go to such a place alone. Albert at once indignantly said that meant his alone she would not, she would be with him. At that moment took Albert by Tiffany's hand and took the other Frey's hand. Albert said, "Besides His Majesty's commissioned a little whether the guy is taking on a little," and looked at Frey. Tiffany yelled to stop them to let her go immediately and stop swearing. Tiffany said Frey would help if necessary, but he'll be outside, okay. Albert replied that since Your Highness had so decided, it would be so. When they arrived at the place, Albert said it was a small pub and they'd sent people here before, but they hadn't found anything exciting. Tiffany said we should see it first, and then they'll draw their own conclusions. Tiffany and Albert went down to this pub. As they passed people, they overheard them not talking, such as, "Let's have one more drink," or "the terrible harvest this year." Someone said his wife had found someone else and he was tired of it. When they approached the bar, the bartender said, "Wow. Yes, he is looking. They are here for the first time, what can he do for them?" Albert said, "Jean, please," and the bartender said yes. He also held out a plate with different kinds of cookies and said with a smile that they have pretty strong alcohol. "Lady, don't you want some appetizers, and you can't get drunk fast enough?" Quietly didn't think that if she didn't eat, she'd be considered suspicious. And if she did, there's no guarantee that nothing was put in the food. Looking at the cookies, she hesitated what to do, but then she decided to take one cookie. She went to Albert and said, "Open your mouth," and she put this cookie in his mouth. Then everyone started looking around and thinking about their own things. The bartender noticed it right away. He asked Madame and they were thinking about something. Tiffany had nothing to do but think of something, so she told the bartender that her boyfriend was bad at this and made a very upset look on her face. Albert choked up at those words, then sort of tapped his back. Then the bartender, who saw the scene played out in front of him, didn't realize it. He was thinking about his own profit. Despite them being married, Divorce is illegal in their country, so many couples use hallucinogens to repair their relationship. If they're married, he has the opportunity to sell them the drug. At that moment, Tiffany just offers her lover a drink of wine and holds out a glass. Albert is just very doubtful. He doesn't understand what's in it and whether it's poisoned or not. The bartender also has doubts, thinking that he needs to watch them some more. Tiffany and Albert were trying to figure out what else they could play to get information. Suddenly, a girl in a very revealing outfit approached them and offered the gentleman a peach wine, at which point the bartender said she was the new girl. Everyone loved her. Tiffany noticed it too, that everyone liked her, since Albert's the one who's been keeping an eye on her. Now Liz thought she'd never miss a skirt. The waitress came closer to them and said, "Gentlemen, you've decided something, but Tiffany said they didn't have to because her date was allergic to peach." At that very moment, Albert was very surprised that she still remembered it, and told her so. Tiffany replied, "Why shouldn't she remember it?" He thought very hard because this incident was in her childhood and it's been a long time since she remembered. Then the waitress said maybe the missus would like a taste. Tiffany pointed to herself and asked. She said, at that moment Albert put his arm around her waist and said, leaning into her ear, "Miss, you don't understand, if we don't leave his wife will be jealous." Albert said in my ear also that beware, it's a man, not a woman waitress. The waitress was upset and apologized and left. Tiffany thought it was good that Albert had revealed his identity, but the girl doubted how it was possible. And then she said out loud so the bartender could hear that she was glad he was devoted to her. But she wished he could make her happy in bed. At which point the bartender finally caught on to their plan and said, "Mrs." He had something he didn't know if they'd be interested. The bartender told the pub worker to take these two upstairs. Then Tiffany and Albert followed the man who led them to some secret room where they would be offered something. This room was on the second floor of this pub, so they had to climb the stairs to get to the room first. The man left, and behind him, Tiffany behind her, was Albert, and for some reason the waitress ran after him and shouted, "Wait a minute." When the waitress caught up with Albert, he stopped, and she started telling him there were more wines they should try. The guy was distracted for a moment by the waitress and didn't see what was going on with Tiffany. When they didn't go up, Tiffany was somehow in front, and behind her was the man she thought, "Why is she going like that? It must be for Albert." But unfortunately, the girl didn't see that behind her boyfriend had already prepared a sharp knife. Literally, up almost to the second floor, this guy screamed, "Die!" swung a knife at Tiffany, and was about to attack her. By some miracle, Tiffany managed to dodge the hand that grabbed his arm and spun around and killed the guy with it. He didn't realize what he was doing, but just managed to say, "What the hell?" When Tiffany turned around, she said, "You think she's that easy to kill?" Tiffany continued up to the second floor because she and Albert had a plan they needed to figure out and see what was going on upstairs. When Albert saw Tiffany hurt the man, he went right after her. The people in the pub started screaming. When they saw the man's body, they screamed, "Look, a dead man has been murdered." Tiffany managed to run to the second floor, and when she opened the door, she was met with a huge and incredible monster. This monster looked like a huge tree with many eyes and a huge mouth. This tree-like monster had many roots or branches instead of arms of different sizes, and its eyes glowed with different colors, from red to black. The tree-like monster had many roots or branches instead of arms of different sizes, and its eyes glowed with different colors from red to black. Since this monster was on the second floor, Tiffany shouted, "Run! The building will collapse!" The people who saw this monster started screaming and hurriedly left the building. Someone shouted that he would be the first to leave. The monster grabbed Tiffany with its hand-like pincers, wrapped around her body, and was already closing in on its huge mouth. At that moment, Albert, seeing this horror, rushed to Tiffany's aid. The boy realized he had no weapons with him, only his courage and determination. He ran after her and shouted, "Grab my hand!" There was only a fraction of a second to save Tiffany, since the monster had already opened its huge mouth, and her life was literally hanging by a thread. Tiffany wondered if she was going to die at the hands of this thing. The roots of the tree were clutching her neck and she was having trouble breathing. When the girl was desperate, she saw Frey with her keen eyes, and heard him cutting the monster to pieces with his sword. When he could chop up enough roots to get to Tiffany, he grabbed her in his arms and over the roots jumped to the floor. Freud said, "Sorry I'm late, princess." Tiffany replied that if he had come a second later, he could have been executed for her death. The girl said we had to get rid of the monster. The knight said yes and drew his huge sword and went to fight. Albert saw that Tiffany was okay and ran up to her with the words of your middle name. The monster is very fast with his roots and pincers. He was able to gather a bunch of people in this pub, wrapped them around his belly and was going to eat them. Each person caught in his grip, screaming in pain and help just as the knights arrived. The knight shouted, "Mister, your sword," and threw it to Albert Hertz with agility. He caught it, but it was in the sheath. One moment before the Duke could tell them to take the princess away first. Tiffany grabbed that sword from its sheath and chopped the roots of the monster in front of her to save the man who was reaching out to her and begging for help. Tiffany shouted, "Protect the civilians and evacuate them all. Don't forget those outside the building. Get as far away as you can from the monster on the fray, and keep them out of the way." The knights all as one shouted, "Obey your highness," and rushed to save the people. Albert asked, "Your highness, do you want to leave everything to Frey and he can handle it alone?" Tiffany replied, guessing. She walked over to the wounded knight who was moaning in pain to help him in any way she could. The guy curled up because his stomach was chopped up by the monster and some green slime was flowing out of it. He stood up and asked, "She's a princess." The girl answered correctly. Albert shouted that, "Your highness, have you forgotten 3 years ago, a similarly foul thing took 1,000 soldiers with it, and this monster is many times larger than what was that?" Albert shouted, "How can Frey alone handle destroying one? It's a huge monster!" Apparently Frey was very good at chopping part of this monster in half in a split second. Then Tiffany said what Albert thought was the reason she kept Freya around. The surprise was that waitress who offered them drinks. She said that it's not over. She raised her hand up. She called up some kind of magical symbol. It filled the whole pub. All around became blue, and on the ceiling reflected a mystical sign. And Tiffany and Albert both said the same thing when they saw it was a magic circle. And strangely enough, in the middle of this magic circle were Tiffany and Albert. What Tiffany did was she pushed Albert to step outside the circle with her eyes. He asked why. "Well," Tiffany said, "because your highness didn't want him to get hurt. She knew she'd feel bad if something happened to that jackass Albert." So in this magical circle, there was only one Tiffany left. Her dress was developing in this magical wind. And when Frey saw Tiffany standing alone in the circle, he began to wade through the force to get into the circle with her. Because he's her knight, and he's supposed to protect her. This magic circle had the property of moving Tiffany for some fraction of a second, lost consciousness because of the strong energy of this sorcery. After a while, she opened her eyes and Frey was standing beside her. When the girl raised her head up to look at his face, she saw that the roots of the tree behind him were already spreading out. But it didn't help. The lady waitress moved with them. She said this time they would surely die, your highness. And the tree held Frey's roots above the ground and strangled him around the neck and stomach. While Frey struggled upstairs, Tiffany was surrounded on the ground below by tree roots spreading out on all sides, trying to grab her. Frey thought one monster was the problem, but there's more than one. What's he gonna do? How to fight them? Even Tiffany knew that Frey couldn't do it. But as it turned out, Frey was just under the force. He had some magical power of his own. He was actually able to summon fire to burn the tree. Tiffany was happy. She even had a smile on her face and said she'd rather have that kind of power than this useless healing she can't heal herself with. Tiffany was worried about Freddy losing his mind. The guy started taking off his uniform because it was damaged by the monster and it didn't make sense. When it came to not only the outfit but his personal belongings, he took off his shirt, and underneath his shirt he had just divinely beautiful super abs. Then, the guy took the girl in his arms and carried her. Tiffany asked what he was doing, and the guy said he was carrying her from here to here. She said, why did he suddenly decide to take off his armor? The boy answered, because they were all covered in the monster's blood, and he might stain your highness's clothes if he took them off. Tiffany was just the kind of girl who could end up changing outfits 3 times a day. When they approached this girl waiter, Tiffany said just like Albert said he was right, she was actually a man. In the little time they had, Frey had managed to defeat the monster tree and tie up the man's waitress and carry Tiffany in his arms out of the ominous forest. On the way, Frey asked Tiffany how she thought the attack had been planned by the Count. But Tiffany said she didn't think Albert was stupid enough to attack her on his own turf. It was someone else. Frey carried Tiffany across the river and set her down on the bank and said, "Wait for him here. He'll be right there." 10 minutes later, Tiffany looked at Frey and said, Where did he get such an orava? Frey asked you about the animals, and on Frey there were indeed a great many animals, and rabbit, and blue, and birdie, and badger, and behind him and walking even a deer. Frey said, "Don't pay attention to them." Guy sat down to give Tiffany something. At this point she wanted to take one of the animals to herself. But for some reason the animal squeaked and cried and refused to go to her. Tiffany screamed, "What insolence! Though it's an animal, what does it understand?" But it still didn't want to go to the princess's house. Freysom planted a badger on the princess's arm and said it seems even such animals understand how scary Her Highness Tiffany's nature is. It didn't like it very much. The guy held out a leaf of a special herb and said, "Here, eat the herb, it'll help with the pain." Tiffany interjected to relieve the pain. Then Frey replied he can't use magic to heal fractures like the Imperial healer does. The guy picked up the princess's ankle and realized that it seems he could break it at the slightest slip-up, so it's best not to do anything. While the guy was examining her ankle, Tiffany asked Frey if he had such powerful powers. But why is he in exile? The guy said his stepmother kicked him out of the house. Tiffany asked him if he was from Snow White, and then the guy yanked her ankle. She didn't expect it. The girl screamed. He decided to try it himself. While he distracted her by talking, she didn't bother him, and he concentrated on straightening out her sprain. The girl continued to hold the herb in her hand. Then he asked why you didn't eat it, and Tiffany replied that she couldn't be deprived of the feeling of pain right now. From somewhere, Tiffany got a moment of weakness and tenderness and put her palm on his face and told him he was hurt. Freud said it was just a minor scratch, and then he froze for a second. Tiffany realized it was the witch again. The witch said, "I'm sorry. I forgot to explain one thing that time." The witch said that healing people with her power also takes her life. He's not badly hurt, so she'll spend a tiny drop. The witch disappeared. He was able to speak again. He asked Your Highness how you were feeling. So Tiffany slapped him without explaining for some reason. Frey thought she was not only untrustworthy but also moody. "Girl, maybe you could explain something." But then there was a voice. "Your Highness Tiffany Princess, are you here?" Girl turned her head towards the sounds to try and see who was calling her. Tiffany said, "Let's go to the fray," but the guy said, "Your leg's not healed. Let me help you." Tiffany turned around and said no need for someone to want her dead, so she needs to appear unharmed. Tiffany walked over to the tree and peeked around the corner to see who it was. She saw two guys. One of them said, "Find her immediately," and the other said, "Obey Crown Prince." And it was clear without a moment's hesitation that it was Joshua. And Tiffany came out of the woods and said, "Brother!" Crown Prince Joshua Cromwell Stewart told her sister, "She's alive! He's very happy!" When the girl came closer to him, he groped her a little in the shoulders and said he could see she was fine. Tiffany replied that her brother had been found recently, so she was fine. But she immediately asked her question how he found them so quickly, and smiled at him. Joshua said his sister suspected him, even though they didn't talk after that night. Joshua said, "But does she think he's capable of hurting her for the throne?" Kinda didn't say what he was talking about brother to her. Just curious how and capital he came into Earl Albert's possession. Joshua said that's how. Frey was standing nearby, looking at them, and thinking they were the model brother and sister. Joshua said he seemed to be thinking a little too much, and Tiffany said no. It was her misdirected question that made his brother think about it. As they stood talking, a crow cried out from the sky and a feather fell. Tiffany looked up and saw the crow and was very frightened of it. Frey noticed the crow too and looked at Tiffany. He didn't think crows scared her any more than monsters did. Frey told his youngest knight to draw his sword. He was going to deal with this raven, whoever she was, but not before brother Joshua used his magic powers to protect his sister. He burned that crow to the ground with one swipe of his finger. The crow was struck by lightning. It died instantly. Joshua said it's okay now and she's safe. But for some reason Tiffany pushed herself away from her brother and ran to Frey as she approached him and grabbed his hands and shook very badly. She said he should have dealt with that crow before the Crown Prince did. Replied that he understood it would never happen again. He would always be first. Quietly she didn't say that to begin with. Then let's go back to the Count. Gates of the Count's estate the same day their carriage took them directly to the entrance of the... Brother Joshua walked over to the carriage and opened the door, giving Tiffany a hand to help the girl down. When they got out of the carriage, he came over and said he was leaving them because his shift was over. Joshua said that he is so good at protecting Tiffany, but still hasn't gotten the reward. Frey replied that it was his duty to protect the princess, and he didn't need a reward. As he left, Frey thought that Crown Prince Joshua and Her Highness were safe, and that no more misunderstandings like this should be allowed. It was a surprise to Tiffany that when they arrived at the palace, Albert stood by her, put his arm around her, and said that how could she push him away? Tiffany looked at him and smiled, because he casually said he felt bad without her. When suddenly Joshua said come back, and then Albert just stepped aside as if nothing had happened and told Tiffany to forgive him. He'd crossed the line. Tiffany was unable to say anything at all. She could only think about the fact that, yes, she herself did not realize whether his feelings were good or bad. Joshua said, "Let's go count. They are already waiting inside to catch the culprits of today's incident." When they entered the palace, the bartender was already on his knees with his hands tied. They started questioning him. The man said that the new girl said she was the Count's mistress, and as for the drugs, they sold them with the Count's permission. The Count is standing next to him. He's asking, but you've never seen the Count's face. Albert started to say Princess he would never dare to hurt her. Tiffany said yes, she did, although she thought he was a scoundrel and deserved to be framed. Tiffany approached her brother and said that he didn't think the Earl had tried to kill her. Joshua replied that he wasn't going to hang any sin on the Earl just because of one worthless accusation. The only thing he said was that the Count should go to the capital until the investigation is over, like she didn't think he'd leave. She still has to break the spell with his help. She can't let him leave. Tiffany screamed stop, because they were already starting to take the Count and the man to the dungeon. According to the information she was given, the hallucinogens were made by the Crown Prince's subordinates. Albert said not to do it for him, Princess. Tiffany went to her brother and begged him to see if someone was deliberately spreading rumors. Wouldn't it be easier for them to get their way after the Earl left? Joshua looked at his sister. He said that isn't she trying to protect the Count? Isn't she? And she doesn't seem to want to get to the truth at all. Then quietly didn't think if this continues, Josh will want to know why she won't let him take Albert away then. The girl seemed to be thinking of something, but Albert himself said, "Enough, he's going with the Grand Prince, no need to worry about him, Princess." The princess said that her brother is already the heir, and he wants to take the other things away from her. Joshua said he could give her the crown, and Tiffany turned around to face him and asked what. Joshua said that no matter which one of them takes over, Ron will run the empire if she wants. He can get his father to reconsider. But first, she needs to stop being so emotional. The princess almost died on the Count's property. How can you not hold him accountable? Tiffany said she has to be forgiven, and especially her disobedient brother. Joshua asked if she'd rather give up the throne for an earl, and Tiffany said yes. Count Albert was present during this whole conversation. He heard it all, and he was amazed at her words. The guy was attacked again. Childhood memories when they were little, he came to her and said, "Princess," he brought her a little present. The princess was so happy when Albert came to visit. She smiled at him genuinely. But the maids taught her differently. They said that your highness is a noble princess, and the young master is from an earl's family, so he will inherit the title. He is only an earl. If you want to play, choose to be a marquis or marquise, so you don't lose status. And Tiffany always said she'd give up being a princess to play with Albert, and only when they were alone did the princess always ask to be called by her name. She wasn't a princess, and he wasn't an earl. They always ran away from their maid and hid in the garden. That's when the memories ended. Albert remembered the same incident that had just occurred. He went over and told her she'd said before that she wanted to drop the princess role when she was near him. Her brother Joshua said that, "Sis, people change." What does that mean? I don't know yet. But the asset came back too. And she thought she should have killed Albert the second he started flirting with her. Tiffany told her brother that he and her father were right. She wasn't worthy of the throne, and just hoped her brother would let her handle the incident in the county on her own. Then her brother said he'd rounded up the prime suspect for questioning and he's leaving the rest up to her. Joshua was on his way to the carriage, but Tiffany caught up with him and said, "Brother." The guy turned around and said it was just like her and wanted something else. And Tiffany said when a brother uses magic power, it drains him. The girl held out her hand and said, "Take the magic crystal then," and handed him a beautiful crystal that could fix a little health. Her brother told her it was a rare item she should keep, but Tiffany replied that unlike her brother, she couldn't absorb the power of crystals, so she took it for her brother. If her brother didn't want the crystal, then he was still angry. Suddenly Joshua hugged her and kissed her on the cheek, and said how could he be mad at her? but instead it bothered him that he was causing him negative emotions. Joshua thought to himself, what's so wrong with the Count since she acts like she's extremely loyal to him? Tiffany replied, brother, don't worry about it. It's not even close to the level of their relationship. They're blood-related, because Tiffany knows her brother's feelings for her. Her brother stroked her cheek and thought for a second and stared. Tiffany asked him what he was thinking about, and the guy said nothing. He had to say goodbye. He wasn't planning on staying long. Joshua got in the carriage and said if she needed him or his help, she could send someone to him. When her brother left, Tiffany thought Joshua probably didn't believe her crush on the Earl. But it didn't matter. The important thing was that she'd gotten her wish for him to stay. Albert came outside and suggested they go inside because it was getting colder and evening. When they came in, Albert said thank you for trusting him. Tiffany thought that Albert was immersed in flashbacks. This was her chance. And then Tiffany asked if she thought their childhood friendship didn't bother him. Albert replied that she wasn't the one who cut it off. The guy came up to her and said that all the gifts he personally gave her she threw away. The girl asked if she threw it away. She doesn't know what he's talking about. Then Albert grabbed her arm and took her somewhere. She screamed where he was taking her. Guy walked up to the room and said, "Open the door and see for yourself." Tiffany went to the door and opened it. When she went into the room, she saw the cupboards and opened one of them and saw all the gifts on the shelves. Tiffany said that when they first met, he gave her this rabbit. But why did it have its ear torn off? She thought the maid threw it away. How did the rabbit end up in his possession? In her defense, she decided to say that she didn't know what happened, but she didn't throw it away. They even replaced all the maids because of it. Albert said that in her decade she cried and begged to be taken away. Even at the risk of the Emperor's wrath, he wanted to take her away. The guy very desperately said he waited for her from sunrise to sunset. But she never came. Tiffany said because His Majesty talked to her all night. When it was over, she ran to find him. Tiffany said in an indignant voice that he might not believe her, but Albert said again on her 11th birthday. He had inherited the title and was waiting to meet again. The guy even remembered how it was when she was 11 years old. He tried to talk to her, then approached her and told Tiffany he was the Count now and could protect her. But she became the eventual heir to the title and didn't even look at him. All she said was that the Earl should address her as Your Highness. All the other friends and girlfriends said that the older princess was dead, and the younger princess had changed in the extreme. He no longer needed him. But they needed him in the future. She will still be the wife of the heir to the neighboring country. Will become empress. Just give up the position, they told him. Tiffany wandered around this room and looked at everything in it. She said he wanted to say he hadn't given up on her. The girl asked if she hadn't gotten caught here because of her drug problem when he showed her this room and all these items. The guy replied, after the wedding, the feelings buried in childhood began to come to life, as if to spite those who did not take care of them. Who knows when the seed will grow a vicious flower? Even if he has to use force, he will make her his wife. The guy blushed with shame. He said that's what he thought he was going to do until he saw her being taken away by the tree monster, and his heart changed. Tiffany asked if he wanted to say he was sorry. The guy said he was, and the girl said let's start over, let's try anyway. Albert said he promised he'd respect her and wouldn't do anything that wasn't nice to her. Tiffany told him he could go for now. She wanted to be alone. Well, Albert didn't back down. He walked up behind her and took a strand of her hair and told Tiffany. The girl knew that his temper was not easily changed. He was once more stretching his arms towards her. When she came back, the guy was on one knee holding a lock of her hair. At this moment, Night Frey walked into a store. The salesman crawling on the floor said, "Get out of here, they're closed today." Frey replies, "That's not why he's here." When the salesman turned around and saw the knight, he said he wanted a rare visitor. Freud said that in the last few days he's been selling magic to monsters. The salesman answered, wondering since it was rumored that they hard to manage considering the knight he had heard lately. He was plowing for the princess. The man laughed. Could it be so? That the salesman made a pity face at the princess, asked who he sold to the seller, said he had enough money and he could stop asking questions. He wouldn't answer anything. So Freud picked up the sword, and the salesman told him that he had part of the witch's power and that if they fought, who would get more of it. Then Frey saw the cat running after the sausage. He swung his sword and cut the sausage in half in front of the cat's nose. The cat screamed meow and started running away, but not before Frey picked him up and took him in his arms, and then said if the seller wasn't lying, he'd take his cat or he'd spill everything in the conversation. Looked around the counter and said he had a lot of stuff, so it wouldn't be hard for him to find something he could use. Frey said he would buy the vendor and the vendor would continue to run his business in return. The salesman tried to reach out to the cat, but the cat wouldn't go to him. Then he had a condition. He said, well, it will also help tame the cat. He said, okay. Then the salesman handed him some kind of box and said, take this as a pretty nice thing. Albert's manor office. Albert is studying his paperwork and says he can't concentrate on his work when there's a Tiffany girl sitting on his desk staring at him. She says just ignore her. Looking at Albert, the girl thought every time before the banquet she takes 3 times insurance. First, she takes Frey with her to protect herself from an assassin with magical powers. Then drinks an antidote that saves her from many poisons and finally casts magic on herself so that no one can do anything to her if she loses consciousness. The spell must be maintained every half hour or the body will be electrocuted. If someone touches her in the 31st minute and she hasn't renewed her spell, they get electrocuted. The 6-pointed star remains on the body, and only when she wakes up can she break the spell. Though she couldn't wake up that night. Though her magic should have worked. But somehow it didn't. I wondered where the seal was. She began to furtively search for her seal on Albert. Albert grabbed her hand and didn't let her see himself. He said they had decided to start over and she wasn't allowed to do that now. Tiffany laughed and said, okay, she won't bother him again. As long as they were doing well, she'd better ask about that incident later that night. Albert asked, doesn't he need his help with the investigation? Tiffany said no, she can handle it on her own. Her only request was that he just stop dealing drugs on his property, and she'll handle the rest without him. Tiffany was on her way out when Albert stopped her by coming up behind her and hugging her. He just asked her to stand like that for a while. Tiffany turned to him, hugging his arm around his head, and replied that being attacked after losing power is obviously a bad sign. So he should help her keep this situation quiet. And what did Albert say about Mock going crazy after taking the drug? Tiffany said it was fine. And then attacking the princess would be changed to, the princess allowed herself to be kidnapped to protect her subjects. That would really hurt her reputation, Tiffany thought. Albert said he was done with work, but Tiffany said they'd see each other at dinner and she had to go. As Tiffany stepped out onto the balcony to get some fresh air, she thought it was time to seriously discuss her marriage to Albert, so that the curse of the wedding could be lifted as soon as possible. There was a knock on the door. Tiffany thought it was Albert. She rushed to the door to open it quickly, and when she opened it she said, you forgot something. But she didn't see Albert in front of her. She saw a girl, who looked at her. She said, Miss Betty, I think as far as she remembered, you are the Count's sweetheart.